Dina and I wondered where she went after our little coup here failed.
Failed?
Yeah, come. Failed.
Faye is dead.
Rest of them are. Ones left alive have to pay the price.
I have this habit when it comes to games I'm looking forward to. If I know for a fact that I'm going to play it, I just don't pay attention in the lead up to release. I mentioned this way back in my Nirvana Initiative video, where for that I watched the first trailer or two and then mostly excised myself from the marketing. This usually isn't even an active thing on my part. I don't go out of my way to avoid previews, reviews, and trailers. Instead, when I see information drop, I go, huh, neat, and then just don't engage with it. This has the added benefit of allowing me to go into games I'm most excited about with relatively few expectations or assumptions. This is also how I approached God of War Ragnarok. In my previous video, one of my main points was how even though I wasn't initially too hot on God of War 2018, the place that game left off narratively left me going bananas over the possibility of what could come next. In addition, my primary gameplay gripes very much felt like the missteps of a dev team that was swinging hard trying to tackle a ton of new mechanics and stylistic choices, but that ultimately left the experience feeling a bit unpolished and lacking in variety. With the foundation now laid, a sequel could theoretically allow them to focus on fine-tuning and expanding on what was already there. And, oh boy, did they expand. Couldn't get this out of the way now, I enjoyed the hell out of God of War Ragnarok. I think it's important to put that front and center because a good bit of this review is going to be spent gushing on all of the little ways the team at Santa Monica Studio went so far above and beyond what they did in the previous game. I happily 100%ed Ragnarok, and while part of that is due to how they managed to fold narrative into nearly every aspect of the game in a way that results in subtle character payoffs no matter what activity you engage with, it's also because gameplay-wise I just had a ton of fun. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's break this down a bit more because there is a lot to discuss. And so, before I have the chance to ramble any further, it's time to talk God of War Ragnarok.
Ready! Together!
To kick things off, let's talk story. I'm going to be delving into some major spoilers, but I will let you know beforehand so you can skip ahead if you choose. The game picks up just before the encounter with Thor teased at the end of the last game. This intro section lasts about an hour and sets up the current status quo. 3 years have passed and we step into Midgard that has been besieged by Thimbleweed. Freya is still very much upset about what happened in the last game, seeks to parlay with our protagonists by way of attempted deicide. And we watch Atreus not only lament the passing of a beloved canine companion, but also grapple with the first manifestations of his godly powers, as it turns out that, yes, he is able to change into animals after all. It's only after this spot of table setting that we make good on that ending stinger as Thor arrives and he's not alone. While I just breeze through these events, doing so admittedly does them an immense disservice. Even here, in the first of many hours to come, countless seeds are planted, the importance of which only become apparent later on. At one point we find Atreus curiously looking at a marble that he quickly hides when his father approaches, for example. And when the aforementioned canine companion, who goes by the name Fenrir, passes away, Kratos sees Atreus unknowingly perform some sort of magic that neither of them fully understands. Kratos himself is also in some ways drastically different from how he was in the previous game. While I understand a large part of that game was supposed to be Kratos figuring out how to be a parent, it's only in playing through this game that I realized how much of that actual father-son relationship was kind of missing. By the start of Ragnarok, Kratos' walls have really come down. He feels like, well, a dad rather than a stranger trying to figure out how to be a dad. He's often gentler when speaking to Atreus. He still chastises, but the fact that it's coming from a place of love and parental concern is much more apparent. And this can be seen in everything from his tone and expressions to the use of physical affection. He's come a long ways from the days when he couldn't even bring himself to place a hand on his son's shoulder. And Atreus, for his part, really feels like the teenager that he is now. He hides things and is visibly conflicted about it, but knows that he's still in that in-between period where he wants to make his own choices, but isn't convinced his father will trust him enough to let him do so. Everything feels so huge with him, only amplified by the prophecy from the previous game. Not only is he a child of God and Jotnar and partly responsible for kicking off the preceding events of Ragnarok, but he has to decide how Loki, the giant of prophecy, fits into his life and his sense of identity. And then Thor arrives, meat in hand, and accompanied by none other than the Allfather Odin himself. They offer to chat, to call a truce, and in so doing give another tug at the thread of the tapestry of our heroes' lives, threatening to unravel the whole damn thing. All of this in just the first hour of the game. To say that there is more plot in this opening section than there was in almost the entirety of the last game may be a bit hyperbolic, but it's the sentiment I had while playing. The simplicity has been sheared away not because it was bad, but because the pieces were so successfully pushed into place that a more plot-heavy follow-up was all but necessary. That said, the fact that I was still able to write paragraphs on Kratos and Atreus' characters without even touching on how their growth affects the actions they take as the plot develops hopefully shows that while the grander events of this universe have come more to the fore, the love of characters has not been sacrificed and has really only been strengthened that they've been given more to chew on with so much going on to and around them. Now, here's where I start getting more into spoilers, so please skip to the timecode kicking it on screen if you would like to go in blind. What's interesting though is that this plot can be summarized as easily as the previous games. In that case it was get to the mountain, and the complexity came from the many obstacles that popped up along the way. Here it essentially boils down to stop Odin, but the genius of making that our hero's end goal is that those two words prove to be an open-ended question, the answer to which can only be found by examining who they want to be. Kratos could easily fall back in his god-killing ways, and we watch him grapple with the desire to do just that. Kratos begins to question if he really is all that different from the petulant manchild that tore down all of Olympus. Is he falling back into old patterns, or is he driven by new, more complex motivations that just happen to result in actions that mirror what a younger, more rage-fueled version of himself would have done? And poor Atreus, so much is put onto this young man's shoulders, both by himself and others. It starts with the prophecy, that conflicting sense of identity that only gets worse when he learns of a champion of the Jotnar that's supposed to lead the fight against Asgard during Ragnarok. Then he learns that his father is fated to die while he supposedly goes off with Odin. It's a staggering amount of pressure and foreknowledge for someone who is still very much a kid. A kid who ventures into Asgard seeking the Allfather in an attempt to find some way to save Kratos, only to discover that Odin, Thor, and the rest of the Aesir are kind of just people? Heimdall is a royal prick who is fully bought into Odin's bullshit. Thor's daughter Thrud has dreams of becoming a Valkyrie and clashes frequently with her mother because of this. Thor is a drunkard who wants to do right by his family but has been systematically made to feel lesser than by Odin. And Odin is insidiously charismatic, fully believing that what he is doing is right and just, to the point that Atreus can't really help but be swayed by him. This all makes things that much worse when Atreus unleashes Garm, a giant wolf that can create tears between the realms. He returns to his father feeling like a failure, only for everyone to berate him for his mistakes and impulsiveness. Everyone, that is, except for Kratos. This is because while fate and consequences are arguably the most prevalent themes, the heart of the tale is about trust, but not in the sense that we often see in media. Learning to trust someone in games, movies, books, etc. frequently comes from a place wherein two characters do not necessarily know or understand what motivates the other. Their arc then is learning about each other, what drives their actions, and so trust stems from gradually discovering these underlying motivations. Kratos and Atreus already have a degree of trust in one another. That's why Kratos is the only one who doesn't admonish Atreus for his mistakes. He knows his son had reasons for his actions and will seek to make things right. In the meantime, Atreus just needs someone to be there for him. So what the two have to do instead is learn to trust that each can be okay without the other around. Atreus is terrified of losing his father and so sets out on his own to try and prevent this. Kratos, meanwhile, has accepted that he may well die at the end of this journey, but is terrified to leave his son unprepared and on his own in a world that is often far crueler than it at first seems. There is so much that goes into this arc, a subtlety that permeates every interaction between Kratos and Atreus. Not everything comes as easy as Kratos quietly being there for his son after a screw-up. They fight and yell, Atreus storms out in frustration, and Kratos asserts his role as his father. There's too much to list here, and even if I could, I wouldn't want to, because it's worth experiencing for yourself. Especially the ending, cause fuck dude, if it didn't get to me. I am admittedly a sucker for good parent-child relationships in media, and the way they cap off Kratos and Atreus' story is so wholly genuine to everything they'd gone through up to that point, while also managing to be relatable despite the mythological trappings of the events leading up to it. Now, while I won't elaborate further on their story, there is one character that I would be remiss not to discuss. See, while trust is something that has to be earned, it also has to be maintained. You can only excuse someone's actions for so long if they, despite their best intentions, keep hurting you. And this, my friends, brings us to the tale of Sindri. I didn't mention Brock and Sindri in my God of War 2018 video, mostly because, while entertaining, they're not all that deep or impactful. Brock is gruff, foul-mouthed, and stubborn, while Sindri is a jittery germaphobe. They're a blacksmith team who had a falling out years prior, but over the course of that game, came back together. While their story is sweet and reinforces the importance of family, they are fairly one-note, which made it all the more surprising for them to be a key emotional pillar in the plot of Ragnarok. In the time since the last game, Sindri and Atreus have become close. Sindri has taken to helping Atreus search for the god Tyr, despite knowing that doing so behind Kratos' back could have dire consequences. After the visit from Thor and Odin goes less than ideal, Sindri opens up his home to our heroes, which subsequently acts as their base for the rest of their adventure. Sindri also gives up a treasure of his, the ring Draupnir, in order to forge a weapon that Kratos can use to defeat Heimdall, and sustain serious injuries after Atreus, in a rage, transforms into a bear. It all culminates in Brock's death after it's discovered that Tyr, who Atreus and Kratos had successfully found earlier in their adventure, was actually Odin in disguise. Brock notices something off about Tyr's behavior, and realizing his ruse was about to be discovered, Odin stabs and kills him. What makes this that much more impactful for Sindri is it isn't the first time Brock has died. An incident occurred long ago that saw Brock lose his life, and Sindri couldn't accept it. His brother and partner, the only family he had left, was gone, so he ventured into the Well of Souls in Alfheim and gathered 3 of the 4 parts of Brock's soul in order to bring him back to life. It worked for the most part, but Sindri kept Brock's death a secret, knowing his brother wouldn't accept his actions, and yet here he was, losing him all over again. All this is more in the background, a slow burn secondary story to what's occurring with Kratos and Atreus until it's thrust to the forefront and you realize just what Sindri has been going through all this time. This is a story of actions and consequences, and people, friends, even those considered family, can only take so much before it breaks them. Sindri was a mortal pawn in a god's game. While they were all figuring out how to best wage war against an immortal tyrant, he was systematically being asked to give up more and more until he lost everything. His home, his treasures, his family, both that which he was bound to by blood, and the one he thought he'd found in Kratos and Atreus. I never expected Sindri, of all characters, to end up being one of my favorites in the series. I get chills just thinking about his story, the place he leaves off. It's unfair what he has to go through, to see Kratos and Atreus get their happy ending while he is left with nothing. Also, I need to call out the final fight with Odin, because having the gods in the party stand around and knowingly be like, yes, he can't do any more harm now, after Atreus uses Jotnar magic to whisk Odin's soul away into a marble, only for Sindri to come in like, fuck that, and smash the thing to pieces, is so satisfying. Like, yes, we get it, you gods are all enlightened and have grown beyond revenge, whatever, but sometimes a fucker deserves to be smashed for stabbing your brother and all but enslaving your people. Not everything in the plot is handled as well or is as fleshed out as this. Sif is one notable example. She's not super prominent, mostly acting as a minor antagonistic force when Atreus is in Asgard, but when Ragnarok hits, she's fully on board with teaming up with Kratos and Atreus, despite their murdering her 2 sons in the last game. It especially sticks out compared to the lengths the writers go to make Thor, a drunkard with a history of abuse, sympathetic. And while the open-ended nature of our protagonist's goal really lends itself to intense self-reflection, how they ultimately answer the question of how to stop Odin fell a bit short for me. The whole game centers on the fact that your life isn't tied to fate, that it is within your power to change how things turn out, but we still end up at Ragnarok regardless? It's not exactly how it was foretold, but I was a bit let down to spend the entire game looking for a means to defy fate only for the prophecy to mostly play out as predicted with some details smudged here and there. I could probably go on, picking away at little things, but the truth is the vast majority of them really don't matter. Any minor quibbles I have are washed away the instant I remember how cute all of Atreus and Angrboda's interactions are, or Mimir asking Kratos what the hell an olive is, or Kratos happily indulging in Atreus' desire to do side quests because he just wants to spend some time with his son, or Kratos wanting Brock's blessing on the Draupnir spear, or just how fucking cool the entire scene with the Norns is. These are the things I'm going to remember when I think back on God of War Ragnarok, all of the little joys I found that left me at once satisfied with the tale and ultimately sad to see it go. All of the excellent writing in the world can easily be tanked if the voice acting isn't up to the same quality, but luckily Ragnarok kills it. The expanded breadth and scale of the narrative allows for a much more diverse array of situations, which lets the returning actors explore more facets of their characters. As mentioned, Kratos has free reign to be softer, more introspective, and Christopher Judge really nails these quieter moments.
We can't hide forever.
We do not hide. We prepare for a fight for which we are not ready.
It took me a bit to get used to Sonny Suljic's voice now that he's grown up some, but once I did, I really came to appreciate the warmth he brings to Atreus. The way he delivers his lines really hammers home both his age and his outlook on the world.
You're welcome to help if you want.
Fine. But are you sure you're up for breaking the rules like this? There aren't any prophecies of you collecting any marbles.
Our endings haven't been written, right? Come on. Shay.
As for the new characters, the standouts for me are Laia de Leon Hayes as Angerboda and Ryan Hurst as Thor. Knowing the myths behind Angerboda, she could have easily fallen into being just the inevitable love interest for Atreus, and while I still would have liked to have seen more from her, that's less because she was underdeveloped and more because I just loved her character that much. Laia lends so much curious energy to Angerboda while also adeptly alternating between stern when she sees Atreus faltering and conflicted.
It says I serve Odin and my father dies. There's just no way.
Look, this is the only way things turn out. The sooner you accept that, the better. Oh, shit, that was mean too.
As for Thor, there's a lot to unpack. From his relationship to his father, his daughter, and his wife, to his thirst for combat and drink alike. I was already a fan of Ryan's from his work on Sons of Anarchy, but what he's accomplished here is so far beyond that.
Take one more step, you're not gonna like how this ends.
Really? And how do you intend to stop me?
Look into my eyes. You tell me.
Nearly every character is like this too, and that combined with the writing makes them all feel multifaceted. Everyone has their own conflicts and desires and histories weighing them down, and for the most part that comes through in every performance. Sticking with sound, I'm happy to say that I enjoyed the score a bit more this time around. It feels like Bear McCreary let himself have some fun with Ragnarok's music, resulting in less generic fantasy fare, though there is still a good deal of that. Admittedly, not a lot of it stuck with me while going through the game. It still primarily plays a supporting role to the events unfolding on screen rather than being a star itself, but going back through the soundtrack, I did find myself digging a number of tracks on repeat listens. That said, my dude, my guy, I know the booming chants and sad horns are kind of the thing for this new God of War, but I just find them so uninteresting, which makes stuff like the main theme hold absolutely no impact for me. Hopefully future games will continue moving away from the style and leaning into the more interesting instrumentations of something like Graves' Lament. Now for graphics. This is going to sound silly, but my first thought after booting it up was, Kratos' head looks smoother? I've been trying to figure out what this means because it wasn't a negative, and I think it comes down to the fine details and lighting. The game isn't leaps and bounds beyond what 2018 accomplished, but it's cleaner. The way light reflects now makes it so shadows aren't as harsh, lending a softer edge to, say, Kratos' head, for example. One critique I do have, though, comes with the characters. Not in the designs themselves, I adore the likes of Thor's gut and Thrúr's untamable mane. Rather, for a lot of characters, they use the actors voicing them as the basis for how the character looks. This stood out most with Richard Schiff as Odin and Deborah Ann Woll as Faye. This is more of a personal pet peeve. I've never liked it when an actor's likeness is used in games, and it stands out that much more here when watching an approximation of the very real Deborah Ann Woll speaking to the most assuredly not real Kratos. I would have preferred they all taken a similar route to what they did with Thor, who has traces of Ryan Hurst, but has been tweaked enough that he reads as a different person. That's more of a nitpick though, and one that quickly fades when faced with the real star of the show, the environments. From the snow-suffocated lands of Midgard, to the ethereal swamps of Jotunheim, to the lively forests of Vanaheim with all manners of magical critters flittering about, to the truly lived-in feeling of the dwarven city of Nidavellir. There was so much variety to the places you go, with each realm having multiple unique environments within them. It makes the realms feel like their own little worlds rather than just being levels for Kratos to come crashing through. This is assisted in part by the reworked structure. Where the previous game had the Lake of Nine acting as a large explorable central hub, now we have Sindri's house. This is exactly what it says on the tin, just a house, with the branching now being a door that leads to the other realms. This oddly makes the game more linear. The realms themselves are large with numerous hidden areas and collectibles coaxing you back to explore, but because there is a clear delineation between them and the hub, they're a bit more like traditional game levels, just on a much larger scale. This change in structure combined with the diversity of environments gave the story a better sense of pacing. They also make it very clear what areas are optional. If you're only in it for the main story, it's easy to quickly get in and out. One mark against this structure is that some areas become blocked off from further exploration until later in the game for story reasons. Like, I get it, but it always irked me when I'd just gotten out of somewhere and couldn't return because the game kept spraying me in the face with a squirt bottle trying to shoo me away. Also, there's one location late in the game that is completely optional. It has a ton of side activities and some backstory, but it felt unnecessary. It was enjoyable to go through, but the backstory felt kind of forced and didn't lead to anything noteworthy, ultimately coming off like the devs were worried people might complain about there not being enough stuff. There is, most definitely, I promise you. So they crammed as much side content into this area as they could to head off any such criticism. But what are you actually doing while traversing these spaces? In a lot of ways, the gameplay is in a similar place to the graphics, akin to what came before, but touched up some. Combat has a similar flow to it, the main additions being unique weapon abilities tied to triangle, like giving your next attack with Leviathan Axe a frost boost, and giving Kratos different shields that each have their own guard break action, such as a forward charge. While the act of actually playing the game is familiar, the refinement is in the variety. A small note, I will be discussing a couple aspects of the gameplay that could be considered spoilers. I do feel they're important to address, and I won't be going into how they tie into the narrative, but feel free to skip to this time code should you wish to avoid them. In the last game, Kratos' primary means of dishing out pain was the Leviathan Axe. While he did get the Blaze of Chaos late in the game, they really weren't that impactful for me outside of their narrative importance. By the time they show up, I had invested so much time into the axe that starting fresh with a weapon that didn't feel substantially distinct on its own meant that I mostly ignored them. In Ragnarok, you begin with both unlocked, and while they haven't overhauled how they play, just being able to spend more time with the blades allowed me to better understand their niche as a means of mid-range crowd control. It helped that using them to pull an enemy from their seemingly safe perch Scorpion style was always satisfying. But then you unlock the spear. I was legit cackling the first time I got my hands on it. I like the idea of spears, but games often boil them down to being purely stabbing weapons, requiring precision when attacking because their range is so limited. Not here though. The standard combo does see Kratos stabbing forward, but quickly follows that up by bashing enemies with the heel and point of the spear, meaning there's no real loss of range by using it. In addition, it's faster than the other two weapons, and throwing the spear will see it stick into enemies as another appears in Kratos' hand. You can do this several times before hitting triangle to detonate all of the spears, turning foes into an explosive pincushion. It's such a blast to launch half a dozen spears into a dude, perform a combo that finishes by generating a mini tornado, then detonating the poor sap. It complements the blades and axe, creating a well-balanced trifecta that saw me shifting between all three using each's strength depending on the situation at hand. Speaking of both variety and speed, the last tool in your arsenal is Atreus himself. This go around, you get to take control of him off and on over the course of the game. Atreus uses his bow, alternating firing arrows at a distance and bashing foes with it at close range. Once again, the developers took a weapon that I don't typically enjoy in these kinds of games and made it one of my preferred playstyles. Prior to Kratos receiving the spear, Atreus had my favorite moveset. His speed and effectiveness at range, quickly firing off a volley only to dash in to finish enemies off with a bout of bow-induced head trauma was an absolute delight. I would have liked to have seen them expand this moveset even more, but I understand not wanting to shift focus away from Kratos given how much time you spend with the Spartan. I won't delve too much into other activities in the overworld, mostly because they're not all that dissimilar to the previous game. There is more stuff to do, a greater number of side quests and enemies and things to collect, but where the game stands out is in how these activities have so much more story tied to them. Some early side quests in Svartalfheim see our heroes taking out a handful of mining rigs and freeing a Lingbacher, both of which are only there because of Mimir. In service to Odin, he negotiated the building of the rigs and orchestrated the capture of the beast in order to curry favor with Allfather. Previously, Mimir was only ever the funny man storyteller, but in quests like these, the game begins to interrogate his role in cementing Odin's stranglehold across the realms. He worked for a piece of shit, and therefore did some very shitty things himself that he's now trying to rectify as much as he can, despite being reduced to a head bouncing around on Kratos' hip. And now we come to my least favorite portion of the review, the systems. In my last video, I found the progression and overall action RPG-ness of the experience to be rather messy. I gave Santa Monica Studio a pass mostly because it was their first go at it and could easily be refined in a sequel. I am now of mind that I just don't really care for their approach to these systems, in addition to feeling like they don't really suit God of War. Some things have changed. All of Kratos' equipment can now be leveled up to a max of 10, and equipment found later in the game is usually at a higher base level. So starting equipment may be at level 1, where mid-game equipment will be found at level 4. Theoretically, this means all equipment of a given type at level 5 should be relatively comparable, so you don't need to feel hesitant to upgrade earlier gear. In practice, however, there's still unique gear that is just outright better than what you can buy, so not much has changed. There's also new equipment types in the form of sword hilts that can let you do anything from get a rage boost to briefly slow time, as well as the aforementioned shield abilities. In addition, runes have been reworked, so there's less of them overall, and you get a unique bonus by equipping 3 runes of a given type. At the end of the day, though, it all just feels like stuff for the sake of stuff. While it was cool to find that specific sword hilt or runic attack or shield run that fit my playstyle, it's offset by the time spent scrolling through items that are either useless or boil down to just being an incremental stat boost. I get that's part of the arc of a loot game, but they're trying to balance the numbers go up serotonin high of your typical loot game with a more consider your loadout and playstyle to find what suits you best of a more thinky ARPG, and it ends up doing neither for me. Every trip into the menu was done purely because, whoops, I got more stuff, guess I'll see if anything is actually interesting this time, which it usually wasn't. My ideal form for these games would probably harken back to the earlier God of Wars, strip out the gear and loot entirely, make the runic attack skill tree unlocks that you pull off by doing certain combos, etc. If you have to have armor, only have a few sets that are drastically different from one another, so each has a unique purpose and playstyle. I know it's unlikely they would strip it back that much, but at the very least I hope the next game sees them finding some way to make the systems that are here more engaging to interact with. All of that out of the way though, I'm in an interesting place now that I've finished God of War Ragnarok. Where the last game left me utterly unhinged at the thought of where they could go next, Ragnarok was an unexpectedly satisfying conclusion. There is most definitely room for a sequel to go in any number of directions, but I don't have the same fervor and anticipation I had when Thor showed up at the end of God of War 2018. At first this felt like a negative, but the more I sat on it, considering not only this game, but the series as a whole and my relationship to it, the more appropriate this ending felt. It's at once triumphant and moving, but also bittersweet and reflective. If we never got another God of War game, I think I would be fine with that. I've been following Kratos' story for nearly 20 years now, and while there's no such thing as a perfect ending, the one we have here is pretty damn good.